Welcome to Between the Covers, the show for readers and writers and lovers of books. I'm Stephanie, and I'm a publisher at Red Penguin Books, where we publish books of all types and genres. So whether you have a book in your head, 300 of sheets of loose leaf in a drawer, and yes, at least once a month, I do get an envelope filled with loose leaf, or maybe a book you haven't even started yet, just visit us at redpenguinbooks.com and unleash your inner author. I am so excited today to be joined by three authors who have definitely unleashed themselves. Our first author today is going to be Gerald Everett Jones. Some of you may recognize Mr. Jones. He's been on our show before, and he's here with his upcoming book. We're getting a sneak preview on Preacher Stall's The Second Coming. Also, you'll meet Merilee Kaufman, the author of Valleys and Mountains, Navigating. It's quite a lovely memoir. And then finally, Richard Sparks is here with New Rock, New Roll, when the gaming world meets epic fantasy. But first, we're going to meet Gerald Everett Jones, and he writes that this book is the most controversial Preacher Wycliff mystery yet. It's the fourth in the multiple award-winning mystery series. A crazed scientist knocks on Evan's door with a bizarre warning. The deep state may be planning to fake the second coming of Christ with advanced virtual reality technology. Meanwhile, a faith-healing evangelist is luring poor and homeless people to a religious retreat with promises of ample food, and then exhorting them to prepare for the end times by starving themselves to death. Evan can't ignore these unbelievable stories when a young woman from his church disappears inside the cult leader's farm. Previous novels in the Evan Wycliff series have won 9 book awards, including Mystery Gold and Silver in the New York City Big Book Awards in the very same year. Please welcome author Gerald Everett Jones. Thank you so much for joining me. So glad to have you with this.
Yes. And after, has it been 2 years, Stephanie, since we
It's
were
been about
together?
2 years, so now I know what you've been doing for the past 2 years.
Well, and you published me very generously in your anthology
Well,
of that story was Spend Time on the Rue Mouffetard, which is actually about a romantic comedy. That was the third in a romantic comedy series I did. It's not all mysteries, but this one is the fourth in the Preacher Evan Wycliff series. And
okay.
yes, fans have been waiting 2 years for this one.
Oh my gosh, they must be chomping at the bit. When does it come out?
It comes out on March the 5th in
Fantastic.
both Kindle and trade paperback, and probably EPUB somewhere after that.
All that good stuff. Fantastic. Glad to hear it. March 6th, and I'm glad we have a web link there.
5th, March 5th,
March
Tuesday.
5th. Fantastic. So this is the most controversial. Tell me, your beta readers said that to you? Whoa, you're really going into.
Well, it was the most controversial by design, just because it's the convergence of some very creepy topics. Is I was doing my initial research for this because all of the Preacher Evan Wycliff series is about unlikely events that people bring to him as problems nobody else wants to solve. This is a small town, southern Missouri. Basically where the series Ozark was set. That's where my ancestral home is. But I had read, and I don't really know where I came across it, but actually the CIA in the early 1960s had planned to fake the second coming of Christ.
Really?
This is reported in the Church Commission report. I did not make it up. It's public information. It's not top secret. But they were not so ambitious that they thought that they could do this for the whole world. But they were going to park a submarine off the coast of Cuba and fire off all these spectacular fireworks. And then the loudspeaker would say, Fidel is the Antichrist. Now, if you remember, if you're old enough to remember, none of us are except me. If this was also the era of this, Plan B was the exploding cigar. So none of this ever actually happened. However, I was into actually writing this book and using this as a premise, virtual reality and 3D holograms and all this other stuff. And I found out there was a book published in the mid 1990s that alleges, it's a conspiracy theory now, which I don't think it possibly hasn't died, that NASA and the deep state are planning this
Ooh.
virtual reality technology. And this has actually been given a name, Project Bluebeam. So if Project Bluebeam happens, I warned you. Okay, I'm just saying.
Oh,
The
well, thank
other
you. I
aspect,
host this show, or else I wouldn't know anything going
well,
on.
the other aspect of this that makes it a bit chilling and somewhat controversial is in our political discourse, there's been a lot of discussion about the potential utility of internment camps in the United States. And the example of what this unscrupulous televangelist, his name is Pastor Obadiah in the book, his fictional name, is that he's got a large tract of land in rural Missouri, there north of the Lake of the Ozarks, where it's something of a farming no man's land these days because it's very difficult to do a family. It used to be a family farming country, but now it's all corporate, whatever. But he's luring homeless and disadvantaged people there with the promises of food, and the part of the part of the tragedy of the situation is none of the politicians are complaining that the homeless people are disappearing.
Ooh.
Now, when I transplanted this particular story, and I won't really say where it came from, the news may disclose it momentarily, but none of these people have been convicted yet. But when they actually start finding bodies on this fellow's compound, because they weren't allowed to leave once they got there.
Right.
And the ones that actually had assets had to sign them over. Of course, that's his engine of, political and financial power. But when I began to translate this to the United States, I thought, well, okay, well, all of Evan's stuff happens in his backyard. So this can't happen in some third world place. This can't be Jonestown. But then I began to realize, and my first thought was, how could you do that here? I mean, you've got Google drone overflights, and you've got, the feds tapping cell phones, and you've got all kinds of stuff happening where it would just be impossible to keep this stuff secret. Well, the thing is that in the intelligence community, as is known worldwide, everybody understands that in these days it's impossible to keep anything secret.
Mm.
You don't even try to keep it secret. What you do is you launch 20 different versions of the same story, some of which are so wacko. Oh, the Martians, or UFO abductions, or flying saucers coming out of the Bermuda Triangle, whatever. And so when somebody happens to by chance mention the truth, or an investigative reporter wants to tell you the truth, the opponents are going to point to the Martians and say, well, it's just one of those stories.
Right.
Okay. So in this story, spoiler alert, when some of the bodies are finally being discovered on this farm, right away you've got social media saying those are pillows and body bags. These are people. And the other thing is this unscrupulous pastor who basically has been saying the same thing that evangelists have been saying. Yes, of course, there have been evangelists accused of faith healing before. That is nothing new. It's not illegal. Okay. I mean, unless you physically murder someone and there's a witness, but if there's no witnesses here, this guy is in a situation where he probably is going to escape prosecution.
Mm.
He has encouraged them through free speech and freedom of religion to do harm to themselves.
Ooh.
But no one is willing to come forward and say he made me do it, or he ordered someone to kill this person who refused to starve.
Mm.
So the analogies to our current situation should not be too difficult to illustrate, because the fear is not only is this fellow giving money to politicians, to conservative politicians who want some people locked up in camps, but also it's possible that he will escape from these charges and he could end up in the U.S. Senate.
So definitely a book for an election year. Is that what we're saying?
It just came out that way. What can I
It just
say?
came out that way. Well, timing your book, I hope you're like pushing your book promotions in that vein so everyone realizes this is not just a mystery. This is a timely one.
All of Evan's mysteries basically are about two fundamental questions. Why is there evil in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And why do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah.
And of course, there's no definitive answer, but these are the things that, he's got it. He's one of these amateur sleuths, reluctant investigators with a curious mind. It's like all these facts keep accumulating in his head, and sooner or later they become useful. And the sheriff has run out of, the sheriff has run out of budget. It's like I can't take squad cars onto that compound. Maybe they've got semi-automatic weapons. Maybe they're part of the resistance movement or something. You think I'm asking for trouble?
Right,
But he
right.
says, but Evan, you might sneak in there as a fellow preacher, and maybe this guy will let down his hair. And if you find anything, you better bring it to me. So Evan is fortunate to be well connected in the local community. But I mean, that's the other thing that's fascinating about writing about small towns is everything is gossip.
Oh, all gossip, all
But
gossip.
but of course, now that we have a global conversational community, everything is is
Yes,
gossip
and it's a giant small town now, isn't
and
it?
just as unreliable so that's
Exactly.
part of the fun, and I,
Love
I do
that.
write I do write to surprise myself, and if I can surprise the readers, then that's wonderful.
Well, does Evan ever surprise you with what the antics going on?
I have vowed, actually, in the last several novels, I can't remember when it started, but when I wrote initially, I wrote business books to outlines.
Mm-hmm.
And if I departed from the outline, I got my wrist slapped. I had to, do mother may I to some, irritable editor. But then my first novel, which was in the other series that I wrote about in your book, that first novel was called My Inflatable Friend,
Mm.
which was a romantic comedy about a young fellow basically trying to get laid. And he had dressed up this sex doll to look like a famous soap star, and that got him in all kinds of trouble, okay, with the tabloids. Well, the thing was that I had written that as a movie script. I'm here on the left coast,
Right.
Hollywood
Why not?
adjacent. Yeah, exactly. Like Richard, I've got a whole closet full of paper scripts that had gone around town. Well, I used that as an outline. I had an outline for that novel, but then as I got into them, I realized that if I actually trust starting from a blank page, those characters kind of go where they want to go and
Yeah.
they say what they want to say.
Mhm.
And then they surprised me. And it wasn't until I'd done a few, especially of the Evan Wycliff series, because there's so many twists and turns. And this is the most complicated of all the plots, clearly. But as I got into doing them, I found that I was surprising myself more and more. And I actually had a couple beta readers saying, I really didn't know what was happening until the last page.
Love that.
It's like,
Love that.
and I had simply trusted. I mean, I almost abandoned Preacher Stalls the Second Coming several times because it was so nasty in parts. Some of
Mm.
the things I really couldn't explain fully because it just really was too much. Okay, because and then but also some of it was so complex because I had to get into grand juries and I had to get into indictments and I had to get to probable cause and I had to do a lot of police procedural that I don't usually do because see, Evan's an amateur sleuth. He doesn't need to know that stuff, but presumably my readers do. So I was discouraged several times, but it kind of all came together.
Came
So,
together, and I bet you learned a lot during this one too, didn't you?
well, I learned that I should possibly be cautious about writing the next one.
I was going to ask you that. You knew my next question. Is there a
if
next
if
one?
they if they line me and Chris Matthews up against the wall, then maybe maybe it's not time.
So Evan Wycliffe goes on, goes on.
Well, Evan Wycliffe, presumably, somebody asked me the other day the definition of writer success, and I said, well, it can't in today's world with a million books a year, it can't possibly be commercial success. But I said, if 100 years from now I'm in somebody's syllabus,
Mm,
I'll look down and say, not bad,
I
not bad.
like that. That's a we'll all have different benchmarks. I always say to people jokingly, if you make it into someone's bathroom, you know,
Yes. Oh,
it used to be
and you
like
won't
the
know.
coffee
You
table.
will obviously you won't know who that is. And I've given presentations to other writers, and I one on historical novels, and I said, well, who remembers the story of Moby Dick? Well, they all learned it, but
Right.
it's like, who can tell me the story? Well, white whale captain, that's about the end of it.
Mm,
And I said, I submit to you that your subconscious not only knows that story, but still acts on that story.
right.
And I said that, 100 years from now, if something I wrote or something you wrote is affecting somebody, there's no way anybody's going to particularly know. It's part of the Western canon of literature. And those are, as Stendhal said, those are moral lessons. People who read novels are wiser than other people, not because they're more moral, but because they see the consequences of bad behavior
I
before
get
they
that.
do
No,
it.
I totally get that. Absolutely. Well, I personally want to see what happens next, but for now, uh, everyone, you've got till March 5th. And on March 5th, you're going to grab your copy of Preacher Stall's The Second Coming and find out what all this chatter has been about. On a completely different note, because you know how I like to shake things up, Merilee Kaufman released her first book, Valleys and Mountains Navigating, a Memoir. And our author writes, have you ever traveled life's treadmill of disasters, hit valleys such as parental split and career aspirations? Then did serious diseases such as insulin dependent diabetes and heart disease become your everyday partner? Ascending mountains, the author has achieved academic and artistic accomplishments, developed lasting friendships, and found love. Award winning writer, poet, actress, and vocalist Merilee Kaufman has ascended to the top, sharing a marriage of 50 years and coping with her husband's Parkinson's disease. Share the strengths of this creative woman and let her heartwarming account inspire your life. So excited to introduce first time author, Merilee Kaufman. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here with you.
Absolutely. And completely a 180 from Gerald. So this is great. I'm loving this. So Merilee, wow. I feel like our viewers know you from that introduction, but even with that, so nice to meet you. And I'm gonna do a little kind of a fast getting to know you for our audience here. So we know long marriage, we know valleys, we know a singer, a vocalist. What style of singing do you like to do best?
Standards.
Standards. Oh yes, I'm a fan. Man. So then I'll have to say Porter or Gershwin.
Difficult to choose. I'd say Porter, but
Ah,
Gershwin comes a close right behind him.
well then I'm going to ask you the real words or the alternate lyrics. Because every Cole Porter song has a set of dirty lyrics that he also wrote, not for the recording, but just for his own personal use.
But I'll tell you something, there's another writer who is marvelous. He's written so many of the songs we all love, Harry Warren. He's the composer. And so that's it. And I've sung many, many of his songs, and they are fabulous. I love them.
Fantastic. Well, your aces in my book. You're playing my tune here. So tell us about starting this book, because very different than Gerald, that came from kind of a businessy. I'm going to get my wrist slapped if I color outside of the lines. This is really just right from the heart. So how did this all get poured out on the page?
Okay, well, you may want to know I started writing. My English teacher in high school said I have writing talent, and he expected me maybe to be a journalist. But we went along life, various things happened, and I began writing. I started working in publicity, actually, and across the street, lunchtime, there was, I must say that I enjoyed so many things, writing and stuff. And across the street was a restaurant that I used to go to lunchtime, a salad bar, healthy. And I went there and I said to, oh, by the way, incidentally, I was writing for a small town publication, New York Women's Week. I wrote articles on diabetes and on markasite. And I went to the restaurant and I said, would you like to have a restaurant review? Would you like me to review your restaurant? And he said, I'd love it. I'd love it. And so I went to the restaurant, I tasted, I wrote, and I wrote my review. And I sent it to the publication. They published it. I was thrilled. And when I gave it to him and he posted it in his window and folks could see the glowing things I said, he was doubly thrilled.
Oh.
So that was the first. And then I said, if I could do it at this restaurant, let me try other restaurants. I see, being in publicity, you have to knock on doors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did. And I got many restaurants in Manhattan with my wonderful husband, Herb. I had him join me. And we went and we ate their wonderful food, and I'd write reviews. They got published. And that was the beginning of the writing story.
Wow. I think Merilee, of all of the authors who've been on the show, hundreds and hundreds, you are my first that got her start writing restaurant reviews. And not just writing restaurant reviews, but knocking on doors and saying, can I write your restaurant review? You are
Right.
absolutely the first.
I'm glad to be there.
So from there to your story, and in between, you were an actress and a singer and a poet and a million things, and now an author.
How did it go? Oh, right. So I was always interested in writing poetry, and I did write poetry. and I took classes and workshops, and finally I decided I was working in the city for a publicity firm, and I said, the Poetry Society of America is located there. And I said, I would like to join them and learn, you know. So I applied, and you had to send like 10 copies of no, 4 copies of 10 poems, which I did. And then I hung at the mailbox and waiting. Did it come? Did it come? Did they reject me? Blah, 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 blah. And it finally came, and I was accepted. I was thrilled at that. And I continued writing, and I had many poems published in small, I don't know if you call them trade publications, but they were from the poetry writing directory. And many were published, and then many won awards also. C.W. Post, Confrontation, I got a second prize for one of my poems, and many, many other poems. And what else can I tell you? Where is it? The writing. Eventually, along the line, I met a wonderful man called, now my husband. He became my husband. We lasted 50 wonderful years. And with that, let me take a sip.
Go right ahead. While you're pausing, I have a question, because you sing and you write poetry. Have you ever written songs?
I tried.
Really?
Tried. Yeah, but I wrote something, but it turned out to be a song that was written already. How do you like that?
That happens. No, that happens. I mean, we're all part of the entire collective unconscious. Sometimes it's very hard not to write something that's already been written.
True. Funny.
Absolutely.
But I've enjoyed music, and at one point I became a singer, but that was later. And in my memoir, I tell the story about that. But where was I? I was writing. And then acting was always a love of mine. And I went to the High School of Performing Arts, but along the way I got diabetes and my sugar got me very high. So my energy dropped and I had to leave there. And then, but I kept up with my acting. I took a workshop and I learned a lot. It was great fun. And then when I had met my husband, and actually I began looking for a husband. All the people my age were, and we called it husband hunting. And East Hampton was a big place that you go. And I rented a share there. And then I was walking down the beach one day and I hear, hey, she looks like a tennis player. And I turn around and bat my eyes. Who, me? And that was the beginning of it. And we dated, and we dated. We had a great time. And that was the beginning. And I
love the way you're describing husband hunting out in the Hamptons. You know, now kids, young people have Tinder or Grindr, and they swipe left and swipe right. You used to walk along a beach in the Hamptons husband hunting. It's just such a fabulous view of a different era. I love that.
Yeah, a different era is right.
Yeah.
So and then I took classes, and during this time Herb and I were dating, and we knew at one point that we loved each other, and we decided to get married. There's a wonderful piece of there about the wedding. But you see, along the way, my parents had separated when I was 11 years old. Very difficult to get these two people to come together, even at the marriage. And my mom said she was paying for it was a low key, inexpensive deal. And she says, if I'm paying for the reception, I will not allow your dad to be that woman, his wife who he's living with, to be there. And it was very tough, but I was seeing a psychiatrist at that time. And I spoke to her about it, and she said, you tell your dad that he's your only father. This is your hopefully only wedding, and you would like him to be there. And that's what I did. I told him that. We had the wedding, a Jewish wedding with they call it a huppah over, which brings the people together and shows that the husband has to obey certain rules. Actually, that was an old era, right? And then everything was there, everything was ready. And then all of a sudden, downstairs, it was at a temple, I see this man coming up. It's my father. He did show up without the woman, and I was so thrilled to see him. It was the best, really wonderful. And then he also pulled me aside at the end, and he told me, she doesn't know, but I saved some money, and I want you to have it. And he handed me a little white envelope with the money. I didn't see it was money, but I knew it was. And when I got home, I opened it. I was just so thrilled that he was there for me.
That's wonderful.
And that was it. And then Herb and I had wonderful years. We traveled. He was a golfer. What did I do? I like to act. I like to write. And then eventually, after the wedding, so these wonderful years. And then, unfortunately, the last 10 years, he developed Parkinson's disease, and I cared for him. And it was a total caretaking operation. And he was wonderful. And he had his mind through the end. Parkinson's depletes your muscle and nerve coordination. But he was pretty good up until the end. And at the end, he died not of Parkinson's, but of a heart disease. So that was it. And then at the end, I said, what am I going to do? Because being a caretaker, you're totally involved. I was totally involved in him. What can I do now? And I thought about it, and I said, well, I like writing. And I met with my friends, and they suggested, well, first of all, you should make a party. Oh, I was going to be 50 years old. You should make a party. Okay, I made a party with my friends, and I had a ball. It was just wonderful. And then I said also, what am I going to do now? And my friend said to me, you write poems. You're a writer. Write. And that's what I started to do. And I took workshops in writing and memoir writing workshop. And I found this wonderful teacher. And she said, who needs a publisher? And I said, I do. And she put me together with this beautiful lady here, this wonderful lady. And that was it. And then, so I was writing my memoir and I came in contact with Stephanie. And that's basically it. And I'm very happy I've done that.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing such a beautiful love story with us.
Thank you.
Honestly,
Thank you.
Such a beautiful love story. Valleys and Mountains. You definitely want to read this story. You've heard about the valleys, the high points, the careers, the love, and some of the struggles. And we all have those mountains and valleys. Our next author.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, you're welcome. Our next author, Richard Sparks, is the author of New Rock, New Roll, When the Gaming World Meets Epic Fantasy. And our author writes, the perfect blend of the gaming world and epic fantasy, with millions watching on live stream, Dax and his teammates Crystal and Grell win the role-playing games RPG Grand Championship. But winning the game was a piece of cake compared to what comes next. Dax wakes up to find out he's turned into his own avatar and is in the middle of a wilderness he doesn't recognize. Armed with a crappy sword he has no idea how to use, and dressed in beginner-level gear, he must figure out how to survive quickly, because he can already hear the bloodthirsty howls of wild animals from the jungle that surrounds him. Thus starts a fantastic epic fantasy adventure. Once the three friends finally find each other, they need to puzzle out their new world, gain skills, combat enemies, and make alliances with all kinds of characters and creatures from the different territories of this new world in order to survive. Please welcome fantasy writer Richard Sparks. So nice to have you.
Nice to be here, Stephanie. Thank you for having me.
I have to ask you, are you a gamer yourself to write?
Yes, I am. I fell in love with role-playing games in about the early 2000s. They've just some wonderful worlds that the designers and developers have created for us.
Oh,
And
yeah.
one day I was actually on a player versus player with these earphones on with 24 people in my group all over the world, galloping around making mischief. And we started discussing. I said, what would it actually be like to be this guy? My young avatar was a heroic battle mage who could heal and blast and cause damage. And well, there's only one way to find out, and that was to write it. And the
Mm-hmm.
idea just fell out of my head. I started writing, that the next day. Finished that book in 2 months. So
Oh,
look, it's
God.
500 pages, 160,000 words. I mean, it's been through a lot of editing with my editors, two editors.
Two
Uh,
months,
I, I,
160,000 words?
yeah, it was extraordinary birth. My wife, who's an artist, said she married Richard because she knew I'd leave her alone. But she said she's a New Yorker too, and she said after I finished, came out from that, she said, for the first time in 40 years of marriage, I actually felt lonely the last couple of months. I was just into it, and then I sent it to my agent, and she said, "This is exactly what people want, and it's escapism and fun. There's a lot of comedy in it." And I said, well, I'm already halfway through book two. She said, oh, great, 3 book deal. I said, oh, it's three now, is it? Actually, I've now written 4. I'm in the 5th. And I
No.
just this morning had the breakthrough in the 5th because I've been floundering around in the beginning. You often start in the wrong place and get lost. In fact, in book 4, the first chapter I wrote ended up not being the first chapter in the book, but I think chapter 13. So it gets, you
That
guys know
happens.
it
No, absolutely.
absolutely. You've got to keep your options open, as Gerald was saying. You got to let the story lead you. You can't just plan it out like they'd like us to do in movie and script writing. Um,
Exactly.
so I just got taken over by this. So I've hardly had time to play any games at all.
I
But the odd
was going to ask you if you still have time to play games, but
No, no, I'm just busy writing. I say I'm writing my own, but it's not a game. It's a real, they find themselves whisked off to a real world for a real reason. They've got to survive in order to discover what happened to them and why. It's all explained.
yes, yes.
But it's just such fun to have an entire world to myself to explore. And
Mm.
coming as from a background as a comedy writer, the the meshing between comedy and adventure. I mean, comedy is not nice people telling jokes. That's a dinner party. Comedy is fear and pain and misery, things going wrong, disasters, agony, and people falling into puddles. Uh, and what good adventure doesn't have all that in it? So, there's and a lot of British comedy, fantasy is quite comedy heavy. I mean, Douglas Adams is my exact contemporary. I was a friend of his since student days, and his books are funny. Terry Pratchett's are funny, as well as being proper adventures. So I was able to, utilize my funny bone. I just had a blast doing it. It's extraordinary. I'm so lucky to have found this whole my bliss as a writer at
Oh,
my great age. And people have been coming to me. Oh, I get a lot of interviews about the older gamer because I thought everyone online was a kid until one of my guild masters said, "I'm retiring. I'm going to be 85 next week. Does anyone want to take over?" And she was a really good guild master, so I don't, not me, but 85, that's pretty good. I suddenly
absolutely.
realized that everybody's doing it, and there've been lots of interviews about the older gamer, and there's a woman called Skyrim Granny. I think she's called Shirley Curry from Ohio. Who's
Hmm.
84, 85. She's got over 1.5 million followers on YouTube watching her play a game, and she's charming. So, and anyways, Alan, you were talking about reality and politics. That's not Alan, Gerald.
Gerald,
Um, you were talking about reality. Sometimes you've got to escape from it.
absolutely.
Reality is pretty scary these days.
Well, Richard, I'm impressed that there's a whole set of 85-year-olds who can't even send a text message, and yet we have these who are all gamers with hundreds of thousands of followers. This is quite a
I
diversity.
I can use a computer and I can shout at it when it goes wrong, but I have no idea how to fix it. So
Well,
I have to call my daughter, who she's a techie, luckily.
but you found the button for playing games, and I love that.
Yeah, I mean, the designs are incredible. The problem with games is the writing, because they're constrained by the limits of the game. They have to write quests that people can get their hands on pretty easily. Whereas if you're writing narrative, in 500 pages, you can take people the long way round,
Right.
and you can, half my books are what the hell is the quest? Just like Gerald was saying with Preacher.
Right.
People only understood it on the last, or figured it out on the last page. That's a classic whodunit if you've managed to pull that off. But
Exactly.
as you go along with my stories, more and more unfolds, and you go, well, look, the answer's staring me in the face, but what is it? And so that all that puzzle playing is you can do in much more depth in a book than you can in an actual game.
So it started as one book. Your
Yeah,
agent wanted three books. You're up to four books.
I've
What are
finished four. I'm still editing with Leslie Robin, our wonderful editor at Kasich. She's absolutely brilliant. And her first note on the book, when Kasich picked me up and offered to publish me, it was about a year and a half ago, they set up a Zoom call with my agent, with Leslie, the editor and the publisher. And I just realized that there was an email from her that had arrived 5 minutes before the Zoom. I was in Texas at the time for some reason. And I thought, I better open this. And I read her notes on the first 6 pages, and they were just brilliant. And I've done a ton of script editing. I'm
oh,
like Gerald, I'm Hollywood adjacent, and I've been in a script writing business since the 70s.
right.
And her first note was, I mean, she explained down the side in great length why she took this approach, and she was coming up with suggestions. And one thing she came up with, cut the first line of the book. And I went,
Mm.
that's brilliant. She said, that's that's a great first line. The second line, that's it. You don't need the little setup before that. And I thought, I'm in good hands here.
Oh, well, thank you for a big shout out. Editors need shout outs. I love
Oh yeah,
that.
oh yeah.
Definitely.
And anybody,
Editing is where you get the gold.
absolutely, absolutely. It's I like that, where you get the gold. And if you gave her 160,000 words, she had to really, you have a good editor there.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's, the moment she finished, she said, I can't wait to read the next one and get stuck into that, which was nice. But she was really thorough, coming up with all sorts of fabulous, I need more of that. I want more. That's a really great character there, that inanimate object. You've started bringing it to life, make it a real relationship, really insightful. And it's so good to have a good editing relationship.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
I've been on both sides of the table.
Oh, have you? Do you edit as well, Richard?
No, script editing, a lot of
Yeah,
script editing.
right.
Yeah.
Yes, well, you West Coasters over there, that's for sure.
Well, in the BBC and the ITV in London in the old days,
Oh, okay.
I was sort of a shadow. The producers would send me stuff and say, "Can you fix this?"
Mhm.
Because without putting your name on it, because the writer had done it and was overwhelmed with the rest of the series, and the
Gotcha.
producer didn't know what to do. So I would give it a polish and send it off, and everyone was happy. Yeah.
We've had authors on before who had worked on a game and they actually wrote like the whole world within the game and then
Well,
decided to transfer it to a book. But yours goes in a very different direction, that not reenacting what happened in the game,
mm.
but it's actually reactionary about what
Well,
happened.
yeah, it's
That's cool.
completely. I was just inspired
Yes,
by being
exactly,
in a game
exactly.
to do it.
Very
But
different bend. I'd never heard that before, and that's a
but
wonderful.
it is a new approach, and I'm really lucky to have found it. But if you think about all the literature, not just in English, but going back to Gilgamesh, for heaven's sake, it's all fantasy fiction.
Mm,
The Arabian Nights, the Thousand and One Nights, fantasy fiction, flying carpets and, you know, thieves and open sesame and Beowulf, the first great uh, work in our language, even though the language has changed, it's rather difficult to read now. There's a dragon and a hoard of treasures and a hero who dives to the bottom of the lake to beat up the monster's mother. It's wonderful stuff. The Fairy Queen, half of Shakespeare's fantasy. And then the 19th century explosion of the Gothic, and then the 20th century science fiction.
exactly.
It's really a very, you can do more in fantasy than you can in reality.
Absolutely. Richard, you were talking about the older gamer.
Yeah.
And, I often ask, who is your, target reader for this book? Is this a book for younger gamers, older gamers, or all gamers? Or what would you say? Who should I buy this on my list for?
Well, at the book launch, we had a guest who was in London, and we had a guest from America who's 83, and she was one of my test readers. And we had one of our neighbors' kids who's 12. He's very precocious, 12, Londoner, and he absolutely loved it too. And so it appeals to anyone. It's anyone just who likes a damn good, rollicking good yarn with a bit. And one of my test readers, who's a producer here in town, the fourth book, when I had lunch with her to get her notes, she said, I read it in 2 days over the weekend, and that's over 500 pages.
Oh my gosh.
So just to keep the page turning, to me, story structure is the mark of a writer. That's what I really, really respect. And I think that, like Gerald coming out of the script writing business, story structure is king. If you can't do story structure, you don't get the job.
Right, right. And Gerald, how about you? If we're talking about who should be buying your book, who are you seeing as kind of your ideal reader? Maybe from what you've known from the past and such. So I would know if I were going shopping today, who on my list am I buying a copy of this for?
Well, I just briefly want to respond to what Richard was saying about
Sure.
structure and drama, and that I believe that even more than my business background, my background as an actor really informed my and I did, yes, I studied screenwriting at UCLA, and also I auditioned at Juilliard. I auditioned for John Houseman, and he said, "Why should you become an actor?" And I thought that was a serious question, and I answered it, but but I began to realize that if I was a writer, I could play all the parts, and I wouldn't have to wait for them to come to me. And that was really something of a revelation, because it was frustrating. I mean, I very early in summer stock, I realized, oh, it's so much more fun to play the bad guy. I thought it was a hero, that was a revelation.
Oh.
So, but as far as who would read, it's interesting with this series, because you might think, okay, Christian fiction. I was raised a Southern Baptist. I was a student minister. Now you'd say maybe I'm like Evan. I'm a doubter on some days. I'm a New Ageist. I'm a I don't knowist. But that's one of the things that makes him an interesting main character, is that he's very much a doubter. He's very much of a flawed person. He's got a problem with on and off with alcohol. He was taking oxy for his back. He can't hang on to, a relationship. And here he is. In the beginning, he's a guest preacher. He's come back because he dropped out of Harvard Divinity and MIT Astrophysics. But in the beginning, he's just basically a data driller. He's doing skip tracing, deadbeat chasing for the car dealer. But he's an interesting character because he's got an arc. He's got a journey from here to there. And I think that's one of the reasons people come to him, is they recognize that he is not holier than thou or above them or talking down to them or he's not giving them a Bible lesson. Often as not, when he's like a skip tracer, the thing that drives the Ford dealer crazy is Evan often negotiates a win-win situation he didn't think of. Is he goes after this one and says, "Get that Mustang. I want that Mustang back." Well, he finds out that she's been mustered out of the U.S. Army, Fort Leonard Wood, and it was her boyfriend who drove off in the car. She had only co-signed for him. She doesn't have a car. And he's driving the loaner over to see her. The loaner's, got dents in the side. It's this beat up gray, gray Focus. And he says, "Well, could you drive this to work?" And she says, "Sure." He says, "Can you afford $50 a month?" He says, "I'll get a ride home." So, yeah, I mean, I would hope that Christian people would delight in this, and the fact that, again, answer the question, why does it, I mean, it was Reverend Schuller, I think it was, who was like, iron pillared people. Why do bad things happen to good people? Yeah, he had a whole book about it. I was taken to Billy Graham revivals when I was, this high. And, I don't think there was a more sincere man on the planet. I don't think some that have come after him have
Agreed.
come to that level, say. I don't think we should be praying for apocalypse in Israel so Jesus will come sooner. Uh, but then again, I mean, that was one of the things we get to in the book is that Evan says, well, he one of the things he studied in divinity school is Book of Revelation. And the Book of Revelation was not accepted by the Catholic Church for centuries.
Right.
It wasn't even part of the Bible. I have visited Patmos, which is where it was supposedly written by St. John the Divine. That is a sea-swept Greek island that is friggin' cold most of the year. Okay. And you have to hike a mile up to the peak to where this cave presumably it's a tourist destination now. So is it the real cave?
It is a tourist
Right.
destination.
So,
sure.
but you come there and you realize, okay, here's John and his scribe, the guy who actually wrote it. So he didn't write it; he dictated it.
Right.
So
Right.
here's John and his scribe hiding out in this cave. They're running from the Roman emperor. Meals are being smuggled up to them. They probably don't really get a meal a day. And it's so incredibly cold. And look at this cold, wet, weeping rock. And on top of that, you've got not Christian, you've got Greek mystery schools of that era that were taking psilocybin as a psychoactive drug for spiritual experiences. If anybody wrote the Book of Revelation today, they'd go, that was a bad LSD trip. Why should anybody base their future on this? I mean, yes, it's pretty clear. Oh, it's a self-fulfilling prophet. It's so much prophecy. Yes, the guy who wrote it was a Bible scholar. He knew how to pay off all the stories. That doesn't mean it's true.
Love that. Love that reading on that. And very, very interesting. Merilee, I have a question for you.
Forgive me. I know not what I do.
and for the rest of our guests here too. We have so many people like yourself who want to get started writing. Now, you got your start way back when, but what would you advise for people who want to start writing a book? You're our first-time author on the show, so what advice would you give for a future first-time author to get started on that first book?
I would thank you, Stephanie. I would say write what you want to write. Find a workshop, check your libraries, and see if there's a workshop that will allow you to bring your work, listen to and have it edited there by an editor, and listen to other writers, see what they're bringing in, listen to their work, and hear the criticism that they get. And it's marvelous to get yourself exposed that way. And if you want to share it with your friends, you can also, and get some reaction there. The more you write and the more reaction you get, I find is very, very valuable.
Absolutely. No, I'm so glad you mentioned that about sharing it. I know when people first start writing, and as our debut author here on the show, I so appreciate your words of wisdom. But it is scary that first time you hand over a manuscript and you ask someone to read it, but the feedback you will be getting will be invaluable, and it will make you a much, much better writer as well, having other eyes on it. Richard, this is certainly not your first book, but what would you share with us as kind of tips for first-time writers?
I'll just pick up on what was just said. Merilee said,
right.
Thank you. There's no graphic. I thought so. I just remember the first time I took a script into a producer called James Gatwood, who was head of Southern Television. My agent got me in and said, James is one of the few people who'll give a young writer a break. I'd had a couple of credits, and it was an adaptation of a book. So I went in, I didn't do nothing about it. So said, do you have a house style? Because I didn't really know what scripts looked like. So he gave me an outline and a book and a script done by another writer. So I went away, read the book, read the outline, thought, oh, I can do this, no trouble. Did the outline, he gave me the gig. Then I wrote the script and I took it into his office for the meeting. I was really quite pleased with myself. I thought I'd done a good job. And he said, no, very good job. And he opened the page and it was covered in blue ink. I mean, lines everywhere, circles. I mean, it looked like a Rorschach blot. It had a blue shit on it. It was extraordinary. And I felt my stomach was being ripped out by weasels. But I knew better than to react. So and we went through the script page by page, and I took my notes, and it was just an absolute sea of blue pencil. And I got my notes. I staggered out of there thinking, oh, God, well, at least I'm being paid for this. Went home, fixed his notes, got the script back to him very fast. And the next script meeting, there were about 8 notes and 30 pages of script. So the lesson is do as you're told.
Right, right.
Absolutely.
The great Scottish comedian Billy Connolly was asked recently, "What's the secret of a happy marriage?" He's married to Pamela Stephenson, the writer comedian, and he said, "Do as you're told." And when you get an editor who's good, and you just, if I hadn't done what I was told, he would have given the job on to someone else. I'd never have got the rest of the series. I ended up writing the rest of the series with Gail Renard, who was later head of our Writers Guild for two terms
Fantastic.
in
And
London.
congratulations on that. That is just huge.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely huge.
Great.
Gerald, how about you? Some tips for our possible new writers out there. What would you say to someone who's getting started on their first book?
Well, my first editor said, put your butt in the chair every day.
Yes.
And that's a pretty good way to start. I mean, even if you feel discouraged, don't get up. And I mean, they say writers have very clean houses,
Yeah.
and as Richard was saying about the secret of happy marriage, you have to convince your wife you're working when you're staring out the window.
Yeah, that's Neil Peart, the drummer
Yeah,
from Rush.
exactly.
Great
So
quotation.
so yes, and then I would say also not don't be afraid to spew it out. I mean, I know that there's a lot of coaches and instructors who will say just spew it out, and and and
What?
then and then writing is rewriting, and I don't always hold to that. I'm a great believer in trying to hear the voice,
Mm,
because if and it yeah I mean, it's not magical, but I mean, if there is a character speaking in your head, or if there is something going on in terms of it feels as though it's writing itself, respect that, because even because one of the things that will happen is if you turn it over to an editor, particularly a copy editor, they're going to write, they're trying to make high school English out of it. Okay, they're going to break it into the compound sentences into simple sentences. They're going to remove the passive voice. They're going to, I mean, and there are times when you need to use the passive voice because you don't want to really say who's doing it. That's what the passive voice is for. So, I mean, there are ways of following the rules, a way to break the rules, but I would say it's a matter of kind of, being in touch with that subconscious, whatever it is that is and finding your voice.
yes.
I had a collaborator who again, Hollywood, right? Hollywood's full of collaborators. And this particular collaborator happened to be female, and it's just let's talk. Well, I don't think we can go forward unless we collaborate. And I said, I don't think Mrs. Mozart ever wrote a note of his stuff. And I apologize. And I said, I know that's a mean thing to say, but I don't. But he was trying to find his voice. I'm trying to find mine.
Right.
And I
I get
guarantee you, if I had gone into that, I might be richer today because I would have,
that.
an award-winning series. But the other thing I think that's really marvelous in Hollywood these days is just the whole way that streaming has affected the form.
Mm,
Is that now we don't have to have feature films that condense everything into 2 hours. We can have 13 episodes of which, each episode is one or two chapters, and we can do some real character
absolutely.
exploration and arc. And I've said this before, but I've never walked out of a movie theater and said, I really miss those guys. But if I binge watch Succession, it's like there's a void in my life until I figure out
No,
what to
no, I
watch
totally
now.
get that. And I love the differences of opinions for our new writers out there. Well, let me remind our readers out there where to get your books. Gerald Everett Jones, Preacher Stalls, The Second Coming. It's coming. It's coming soon. So you'll be finding it just in a matter of a couple of weeks on March 5th, but you want to grab that and the other books in the Evan Wycliff Mystery Series. Valleys and Mountains by Merilee Kaufman. Such a personal and beautiful story. Learn more from this wonderful 50-year spanning love story and life of our author. and New Rock, New Roll by Richard Sparks, when you want to have gaming world meeting epic fantasy. This is book one. We heard there's a lot more here to come, so get started on this first one and then grab the others. And for my authors here, some of whom are, it's not your first time here, I can't wait to have you back on the show. So for all of you, happy writing. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for being such an inspiration to our writers.
Stephanie, my book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles.
Yep, it absolutely is. Thank you, Merilee. And
okay,
thank you to all of our writers.